So let me now talk more generally about the orphan drug business, because it really has changed quite a lot over the course of the last couple of decades. And this is an example of how it's changed. So what's plotted in the left graph is the number of orphan drugs approved year by year. And in 1983, when the Orphan Drug Act was enacted, you had maybe 2 orphan drugs approved, and that was generally the level of activity in this space. 1, 2, 3 handfuls of orphan drugs approved each year prior to 1983. After the 83 Orphan Drug Act, not surprisingly, you see an increase. But then there's another increase starting around 2002, going all the way up. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. What's particularly interesting about this approach is that if you take a look at the top 10 selling drugs of any kind, out of the top 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are orphan drugs. Now again, not all of them are orphan in the same sense that Soliris is. They're not all rare. Some of them, like Herceptin, are orphan designation because they've been stratified to the point where they fall into the orphan drug definition. It's a very profitable business. And let me explain now where that bump up occurred in 2002. So these are orphan drug indications, not just in the US, but also in Europe and Japan from 83 to 2014. And you can see that it's not just in our country, but in Europe that orphan designations have been going up, and to a lesser extent in Japan. But 2002 seems to be another inflection point in the growth of orphan drugs. What happened in 2002? Not surprisingly, another piece of legislation. What happened in 2002 is the Rare Disease Act, which established the Office of Research on Rare Diseases. And that was part of NIH. And another part of NIH, the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, or NCATS, was created to be able to coordinate and combine all of the various pieces of disparate information on rare diseases and therapies, so that it's now much easier to access what's out there, who's doing what, and to bring the various different parties together. So various pieces of legislation have really changed the space here, so that you've got a lot more investors, entrepreneurs, scientists, clinicians, and patients focusing on these various different kinds of diseases. And I would argue that that could be a very good thing, because as we learn more about how to deal with all these rare diseases, it actually helps us more generally with dealing with all kinds of diseases. But there are some complications, so I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. Let me now turn to the finance part of it and explain why this is such an important illustration of portfolio theory. I want to go back to what we talked about before regarding correlation, and the fact that if you can actually reduce the correlations, you can reduce the risk. If you can reduce the risk for a given level of return, you increase the Sharpe ratio. As you increase the Sharpe ratio, you can move that tangency point more northwest. You can get more investors excited about investing in these kinds of opportunities. So let's go through and do the math of how you calculate the rates of return on investing in these kinds of assets. So this is a hypothetical portfolio of M orphan disease drugs. Each drug costs C dollars to be able to develop. The cost of capital, I'm going to assume is just some number R. It's going to take Q years before we get approval. If we succeed in getting approved, we'll earn X dollars a year for the remaining patent life, and that amortizes into Z using the annuity discount formula of 20 minus Q years left of my patent. Okay? And the expected value of my portfolio is going to be given by the number of hits, the number of approvals out of M rare disease projects multiplied by this value Z times the number of hits. Okay? So the expected NPV is just the probability of having at least K hits multiplied by K times Z. And the expected total rate of return is equal to the expected NPV divided by m times c minus 1, and then I annualize that by taking the 1 over qth power minus 1. So these are the formulas that I'm going to use in order to calculate some of the back of the envelope numbers that I do in a minute. All right, any questions about that? Okay, so let's do a couple of calculations. So I'm going to do the calculation that I did for all of you in the very, very first lecture for cancer, but now I'm going to change the numbers to make it relevant for rare diseases. For orphan diseases, I'm going to model the number of hits as a Bernoulli trial. But instead of a 5% probability of success, which is what you see in oncology, for rare diseases, the probability is more like 20%. Now, that's a very broad brush number, and there are obviously different kinds of rare diseases, different therapies. Some are very difficult to deal with. Pediatric cancers are one of the most difficult targets to try to identify therapies for, because when you're very young, you have no genetic biomarkers because you haven't had time to develop mutations. It's very difficult to know how to treat pediatric cancers. So the probability of success in that case is probably less than 5%. However, if you think about certain other diseases that are caused by mutations, for example, you have a mutation that prevents your body from producing a useful enzyme. Very often you can actually fix the problem by replacing the enzyme, manufacturing the enzyme artificially and putting that back into the human body. Those kinds of enzyme replacement therapies are relatively easy to understand and implement. It's not trivial, obviously, but the probability of success, since we know how to do that, is going to be much higher than 5%. So when you take broad brush all of the various different rare disease therapies that you might develop, 20% seems like a more reasonable number than 5. Okay, so $75 million instead of $200 million to develop a single orphan disease therapy. Why $75 million instead of 200? Well, by definition, you're talking about a smaller patient population. You can't do a clinical trial of 5,000 patients. There aren't 5,000 PNH patients in the United States. So you're talking about relatively small samples. So the cost of clinical development is lower. Plus, remember, you get all these benefits from the Orphan Drug Act. That's got to factor into those numbers as well. And finally, the payoff for orphan drugs, well, it varies. I just showed you Alexion Pharmaceuticals is making $3 billion a year in revenues, $400 million in profits. I'm going to assert that, for simplicity, the particular portfolio we're going to look at is going to have $150 million profit per year for a 13-year period. I'm going to assume it takes about 7 years instead of 10 to develop a rare disease therapy. All right, those are the back of the envelope numbers that I'm going to assert. And so just to be clear, it's going to take 7 years. It's going to take a 20% probability to succeed. If I succeed, I'm going to generate profits of $150 million from year 8 to year 20. Okay? Any questions about that? Cost of capital, I'm going to assume, is 10%. If I amortize this $150 million over 13 years to an NPV, that's $1.1 billion in year 7, which compounds to about 46% return for that 7 years with 20% probability, or minus 100% with 80% probability, an expected return of 16% with an annualized standard deviation of 214.8%. That's what a single rare disease drug looks like, one of them. Okay? So quite a bit more attractive than cancer. When I show you the cancer profile, most of you had no interest in investing in that. I suspect a few of you, not many, but a few of you would at least be willing to invest in this, right? A 16% rate of return is not bad, but it's got a lot of risk. Well, we can do something about the risk by putting it into a portfolio. And this is where portfolio theory really comes into its own. If I now put this into a portfolio, because the correlations among different rare disease projects is almost by definition 0, I have that multiplier times the Sharpe ratio of the individual rare disease project. Now, I want to get back to this issue by correlation and why I'm saying that the correlation is 0. Can anybody give me some biological logic as to why the correlation should be 0 between 2 orphan disease projects? John?
Biological pathways for orphan diseases are basically guaranteed not to be related to each other.
How are they guaranteed not to be related?
By definition, since they're orphan diseases, they're basically isolated from each other.
They're random, right? They're random mutations. Exactly. Now, it may be the case that they're all caused by the same terrible thing. If it turns out that we discover years later that, I don't know, watching certain TV shows gives you rare diseases, that would be bad. But most likely, that's not what's going on. And if it's random mutations, that's a biological narrative that's telling you that the sigma matrix is diagonal. That's huge. That's a huge insight. Now, it's not necessarily true. It's possible if you have 2 particular therapies targeting the same rare disease or similar rare diseases, both blood disorders, it could be that if you're making use of the same idea of disrupting a particular kind of enzyme that happens to be implicated in both, that if you fail in one, you might also fail in the other. That's possible. But the thing is, the science will tell you that. Typically, these rare disease drugs are developed not as black boxes. They're developed based upon the underlying science, the underlying mechanism of the disease. And so if you know that, if you know what you're developing, you can actually calculate explicitly what the likely correlations are. And in the case of rare diseases, it's beautiful because by definition, they are very likely to be uncorrelated. So now, let's do the math. If I have a 16% rate of return, 3% risk-free rate, 214.8% standard deviation, my Sharpe ratio per project is going to be 0.0609. That is not something that will get anybody excited. But I get to multiply that by the number of projects using my formula for the multiplier. And given that rho, the correlation, pairwise correlation is 0, the multiplier turns out to be square root of n. So if I have a portfolio of 50 rare disease therapies in my portfolio, 50 of them, my Sharpe ratio becomes 0.43. If I have 75 rare disease therapies in my portfolio, 75 of them, my Sharpe ratio becomes higher than Warren Buffett's Sharpe ratio. I get a 16% rate of return, and I can drive down the variance to whatever level I want. In fact, if I could manage a portfolio of 1,000 rare diseases, I can have a portfolio that just looks better than any hedge fund that ever existed on this planet, if I could do that. Or if you could do that. I know I can't do that. But the question remains whether or not it's possible to put together these portfolios. I'm not going to answer the question today. In fact, I'm not qualified to answer the question, but there'll be speakers over the course of the next few weeks that will be able to answer the question, some of whom are actually doing it. So this is one of the reasons why rare diseases is so special, but it's not the only kind of assets that you might want to include here. There are many other diseases, and you have to balance off the profitability of the disease with the revenue potential and also the potential pushback that you're going to get from payers.